So in some respects, you could say Phil Saviano is just like any other SNAP leader. He saw a need, he stepped up, he started a support group, he cared about prevention, so he started doing advocacy. But there's some unique and special things about Phil. He comes across as pretty self-effacing, pretty laid back, but if you look a little bit deeper, you'll see that there's a huge reservoir there of incredible strength and stamina. Phil was really one of the trailblazers of this movement and this organization. He started speaking out publicly very, very early in the history of our movement, back in 1992. At the time, he was grappling with a serious illness that came close to bringing him down. But still, 1 week before Christmas, he was leafing through the Boston Globe, and he saw that Father David Holley, the same priest who molested him back in the 1960s, was accused of assaulting kids in Texas in the 70s and New Mexico in the 80s, and had just completed another priestly assignment in Denver. So Phil, of course, reached out to those men in the West. He gave his support to their allegations by going public about his own abuse, and Phil was essentially reborn as an activist. His story made page 1 of the Boston Globe, was picked up in cities across the country where Holley had worked, and in February of 1993, he made page 1 of USA Today. And you'll see he looks no different now than he did back for 93. Holley was soon after indicted in New Mexico, and he was later sentenced to 275 years in prison, the longest ever. But Phil kept plugging away, and in fact, some accused him of being driven by this cause. He spent many, many nights in the library, back in those old days, not on the internet, but looking through microfilm and finding newspaper accounts from abuse cases all over the U.S. He talked to victims, he collected stories, he built files, bought Jason Berry's book, Richard Sipes' book, devoured them. He did essentially what was right, what was painstaking, what was hard, obviously thinking not one bit about recognition or reward in any sense. Just trying to sort out these cases and who knew about Holley and who shielded Holley and all these other predators. He kept wondering how in the world could this be happening? So many priests abusing so many kids and so many church officials saying and doing so little. He approached his own diocese, the Worcester Diocese. They, of course, denied problems, denied Holley's history. I know, you're shocked, right? And then he united with 3 other Worcester victims to file a suit against the church to open up the files of the Worcester Diocese. It was essentially one of the very, very first abuse and cover-up cases filed in the Boston court system. And very soon, Phil had copies of letters showing that 6 bishops in 4 states knew that Holley was a child molester and said or did nothing to stop him, and that he'd gone to 3 church treatment centers. I guess I should say treatment centers. At times, Phil felt very alone, very discouraged, very disgusted, very overwhelmed, and very angry. That sounds familiar to anybody in this room? But people who Phil really, really respected and trusted said to him, move on, focus on your health, drop this ugly shit. But then there was a turning point. Unable to bring his lawsuit to trial, the diocese presented him with a settlement agreement that had strict confidentiality requirements. This was standard procedure, his lawyer said. Everybody signs these, but not Phil. Phil had learned too much about the way church officials put kids at risk, and so he fought back, and his own attorney threatened to resign from representing him if he didn't sign the gag order. Phil's response was, go ahead. Sorry. I'm happy to walk away from all this, Phil said. I am not keeping the church's secrets for them. That's when he reached out to a group called SNAP. Friday, November 3rd, 1995, he called some guy named David Hesse on the line, and Phil remembers the relief he felt when he reached somebody who had the same kind of experiences and said he was willing to help. Phil will let you in on what happened next, but the next Boston Globe story had a headline that predicted Phil's future work, and the headline was simply, "He refuses to be silent." 6 months later, Phil achieved his goal. He settled his case without a single mention about confidentiality, and he was the very first person in Massachusetts to do so, the very first. Shortly thereafter, he got a note from Jason Berry, who said, "Congratulations on retaining your freedom of speech." Phil, sit tight, Phil got the massive settlement of $12,500 from the Worcester Diocese. He got $5,400 after all the expenses, but in terms of being able to speak his mind and stand up with other victims and expose secrets, Phil felt like a wealthy man. By the spring of '97, his health was on the rebound. He was active in a small group of Massachusetts survivors, and that's when he decided to sort of formalize his outreach work, starting the first New England chapter of SNAP. And over the next few years, he became the public face and voice for countless men and women and teenagers and kids who could not then speak for themselves. He tried relentlessly, and he was a publicist. Right? He knew what he was doing when it comes to media work, and he tried relentlessly to get the media to take a closer look at the subject, repeatedly pointing out to them that the abuse and the cover-up was far more widespread than they could imagine. He pitched investigative stories to the Globe and the Herald and the Associated Press and Time Magazine and ABC News in 2020. And he stressed, too, by the way, even though in those early years, that there were just as many female victims as male. And he got nowhere. He got nowhere. But in August of 2001, the Boston Globe's investigative team came calling. And when they did, they found a guy who was very eager to share with him not just his knowledge, but his vast files, his lists of priests, abusers in 2 dioceses, his treasure trove of documents that he had painstakingly collected and filed and retained, and his familiarity with the work of people like Sipe and Berry. And at that point, August of 2001, Phil personally knew more than 80 victims of Boston priests. He was sworn to secrecy by the Spotlight team. Why does everybody want to keep you quiet? But he collaborated with them for the next several months, and he gave them the names of 14 more Boston priests on top of the 2 that they started with. Inspired by what Phil had managed, Phil, an amateur, they were thinking, inspired by what he had accumulated just on his own, no subpoena powers, no investigative skills or background, the Globe Spotlight team realized that if he could get that much information, imagine what they could amass with their resources and their skills. So they went to court to unseal settlement after settlement after settlement. A judge said, okay, and the rest, they say, is history. This quiet little, what had long been for decades, a quiet little internal church problem had become, starting to become, a global crisis. While all this was unfolding, Phil knew that there was one more task ahead of him. Knowing that this story was going to be huge, he radically revamped and updated and expanded our little tiny amateur SNAP website and made it into a resource that journalists all over the world began pouring to every single day as these Globe stories were rolled out. In early 2002, when the Globe finally started reporting on this, it lit a fire under investigative reporters from coast to coast initially, and then, of course, abroad. And he added to the website a discussion board that was extraordinarily helpful and widely used with the help of Mary Grace Labella, who's here, and was a huge emotional outlet and information outlet for victims, for advocates, for concerned Catholics, and prosecutors and police as well. In late 2002, Phil had essentially stepped back from his position as the head of our New England chapter. He kept running the website for several years. More recently, he went to The Hague with us when we filed the International Criminal Court a couple years ago. Also was at our conference in Ireland and just stepped down after a 3-year term on the SNAP board. Several years ago, the Boston Phoenix newspaper named Phil a Boston local hero. There have been a ton of accolades for Phil over the years, but one of the best testimonials comes from a Boston Herald reporter who wrote in 2002, "Saviano is what we don't see enough of in this tragic story. I might go beyond that and say what we don't see enough of in this life, but she wrote a living, inspiring example of a man who has struggled to come to terms with what happened and triumphed. So because of Phil's triumph and his persistence and his refusal to keep crimes and cover-ups a secret, we are in this room together today. And literally millions of kids are safer. So we're thrilled to present Phil with the SNAP Pioneer Award.
What do you think?
I got to say this, as an old timer in SNAP, Phil looks at this and goes, with surprise, this is actually pretty nice. It's not printed on cardboard.
We're evolving every year.
That's right.
Okay, hello, hooray. Thank you, David, for what is clearly the introduction of my lifetime. I really did all that, then how come I'm still shy and insecure? I do have my days, believe it. But I want to say that to be honored and recognized here by SNAP leadership and to have it happen amongst so many other survivors today, it makes me very, very happy. So thank you very much. I'm especially pleased that there are two newspaper reporters here who were dedicated to the cause and provided me personally with some much needed validation in the past. So I want to salute Kathy Shaw, formerly of the Worcester Telegram and Gazette. I salute Walter Robinson of the Boston Globe Spotlight team. I don't know where he is. Are you here? Hello, Walter. And if Michael Resendiz from the Spotlight team was here, I would be saluting him too. So it's been more than 50 years now since the months of my abuse, and more than 2 decades before I became part of this clergy abuse survivors movement. Since this is a Pioneer Award, I thought I would talk about how it was that I went public so early, back in 1992. What was going on with me in those days? So if you have time for a story, I want to tell one. First of all, I grew up in a little town in central Massachusetts in the Catholic Diocese of Worcester, located about an hour west of Boston. In 1964, the bishop assigned a new priest to my parish. His name was David Holley. I was 11 and a half at the time. He was 36. From my point of view, he was very tall. He was kind of chubby. He was unusually friendly towards kids. He told some funny stories, and he knew some cool card tricks. So when Father Holley took an interest in me, I felt lucky, and I trusted him. By the time I figured out that his interest was only in sexual gratification, and that he was going to get it from me one way or another, even if he had to drag me into it by my skinny wrist, I didn't feel so lucky anymore. What I felt was trapped, confused, scared of him, grossed out, and embarrassed. I wanted it to stop, but I worried that if I called out for help, the whole town was going to find out about it. For a boy who had not yet gone through puberty, this was a lot to contend with. But then, 18 months after he arrived, the priest suddenly left town. Nobody seemed to know where he went or why, but he was definitely gone. And I was definitely glad. So let's fast forward now through a few decades. In my 20s and my 30s, I always remembered what happened to me. I didn't repress the memories, but I never thought that any of it was very important. Yes, through adolescence, through my college years, I had some emotional difficulties. I struggled with deep insecurity at times. I had trust issues. I had problems with authority. I had confusion and anxiety about all things sexual, but I never, ever made a connection between these problems and my childhood abuse. And what did I think of Father Holley? Well, I thought he was one of a kind. He was the one pedophile who had somehow managed to slip through the priesthood screening process and then, by very slim chance, ended up in my hometown. Imagine that. I also felt sure that well before the 60s were over, he would have been caught with a kid, reported to the police, booted out of the priesthood. In other words, clueless. I was clueless about this issue. But the bolt of lightning that brought wisdom my way finally arrived in December of 1992. And this is what I want to tell you about. But I have to set the stage. One result of those previously mentioned issues with sex is that I ended up getting infected with AIDS. And by June of 1992, when I turned 40, I was in the throes of it. I'd had 2 bouts of AIDS-related pneumonia. I had lost 30 pounds due to relentless diarrhea. I did learn a lot of medical terms. For example, I had a drug-resistant, opportunistic infection with a microscopic protozoa called Cryptosporidium. It had traveled from my intestine to my gallbladder and was now heading to my liver, where I was told it would likely prove fatal. My doctor encouraged me to get my affairs in order, and so I did. I bought a cemetery plot. I started interviewing undertakers, trying to figure out which of them was going to do a better job with the makeup. I really did. So then, fate stepped in. Do you believe in fate? Coincidence? Divine providence? Luck? It all came my way, because my doctor did some creative dosing with AZT, which at that point was the only AIDS drug available. And I had a reprieve, a stay of execution, so to speak. I started getting better. My infections cleared up. I put on 10 pounds. I got my energy back. Some thought it was a miracle. My father thought it was payoff for all the money he had sent to the League of St. Jude, patron saint of hopeless cases. Whatever it was, with great joy, I started making plans to celebrate one more Christmas. And that is when Father Holley came back into my life. On December 16th, I was preparing to go out Christmas shopping, sitting at my kitchen table, leafing through the Boston Globe, checking out the ads. I turned a page, I turned a few more, and then suddenly, there it was. A small story about 2 guys from New Mexico accusing a former Massachusetts priest of child sex abuse down there in the 1970s. It was Father Holley. I read the story and I learned that he had remained a priest for some 30 years, having assignments in 3 states in the Southwest after he left Massachusetts. And there it was, my life-changing moment, because in a flash, I knew that I had been a fool to make those assumptions about him being caught and booted out of the priesthood many years before. Light shone on Phil's head. So I reached out and I spoke to 2 victims who were part of that story. One of them, named Robert Curtis, was a lawyer in Albuquerque. He was the organizer. He had recovered his memories, tracked down Father Holley in Denver, then searched out the other Holley victims in New Mexico. At last count, there were 29 of them. Then he sought help from Holley's home diocese in Worcester. When church officials told him, basically, stop bothering us, he turned to the courts and the news media. Robert and I talked at length. He challenged me to set the record straight and let it be known that the problems with Holley had started back in Massachusetts in the 1960s. We agreed that if Worcester officials had taken proper action, those many kids the priest assaulted out west would have been safe. Robert wanted me to go public, and being a lawyer, he knew how to be persuasive. Here's what he said. It's a rare occasion when someone can take a stand on an issue and affect the lives of countless people he will probably never even meet. Was I intrigued by the idea of doing something important at the end of my life? Yeah. Did I want to get mixed up with this controversial issue that clearly I knew nothing about? No, I didn't. This was so embarrassing. Talk to a reporter about this? I don't think so. On the other hand, this was about protecting kids. Well, yeah, but those kids in my high school, I knew that they were going to ridicule me. What to do? What to do? Finally, I said to myself, Phil, get a grip. You are a gay man dying of AIDS. How hard can this be compared to what you've already gone through? And what have you got left to lose? You're already sick, you're broke, you're single, you're lonely, your career's destroyed, your reputation tattered. But suddenly you've been blessed with an unexpected burst of health. Make the most of it. Put it to use. So I thought more about Robert Curtis and what he'd said about the rare opportunities, and I thought, well, here's a guy well respected in his community, married, children, a career. If he can do it, then why not me? So I went for it. I called the Globe, I told the story, made some headlines in a bunch of cities, ruined the family Christmas celebration, did some TV interviews, and then I got my picture on the front page of USA Today. But then, some remarkable things started happening. Some other victims of Father Holley in Massachusetts came forward. And then victims of other Worcester priests came forward. And I'm going to take another 2 or 3 minutes here, because what I want to say is important. I think what Robert was referring to was what happened. You know, I found my courage, and then other victims found their courage, right? First person knocks down the door, and then other people are able to walk through. So today, I pay tribute to Robert Curtis in Albuquerque. In 1992, he put his reputation and career on the line. He went after Holley, he went after the Worcester Diocese, and then he went after me. And I see a ribbon that runs from him, through me, to the other Worcester victims, and even to the people that came to my SNAP support group meetings years later. It goes to anyone who ever saw me in the news and said to himself, right on, I'm telling my story too. And the same is true with all of you survivors here. Every one of you who has gone public with your story of abuse, you have your own constellation of survivors, people who have seen your story and been inspired by it. You may have no idea who most of these people are, but they certainly know about you. So in November, when you see the Spotlight film, and you watch the scene where Neil Huff, the actor who's playing me, holds up my kid picture and tells the Spotlight team about being preyed upon by Father Holley, I hope you all will tip your hat to Robert Curtis in New Mexico and to the other early risers like Frank Fitzpatrick in Massachusetts, Barbara Blaine in Ohio, Ed Morris in Pennsylvania, David Classie in Missouri, Peter Isley in Wisconsin, Mary Grant in California, and others. All the people who found their voices early and got things rolling way back in the pioneer days of our movement. And now, before I finish, I have one more thing I want to say, and this is for any sex abuse victim who might be watching this video online. If you've been keeping your abuse a secret all these years, Robert and I have some advice for you. Whether your tormentor and abuser was a priest, a minister, a nun, or a rabbi, the wrestling coach, the football coach, the camp counselor, or some TV star, recognize the power within you. Find the courage to speak out. Then pass that courage along to some other silent, suffering stranger who will see you or read about you and say, gee, if she can do it, or boy, if he can do it, then maybe I can too. Thank you very much. Thank you, Snap, for honoring me. Remember this little guy.